This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another episode. But before we get into today's program, I just wanted to remind everybody that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network. So go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, religion, media, and society. And we also have subscriptions you can do free or paid. And my thanks especially to everybody who's doing a paid subscription. So thank you very much for that. All right, so with that little plug out of the way, let's get into today's program. The Republican Party is completely and utterly dominated by a small faction of political and religious extremists with policies that are incredibly unpopular, such as privatizing Social Security or criminalizing birth control. And yet, in spite of this fact, Republicans are still able to win many elections, even outside of their stronghold of the old Confederacy. Sometimes, as in the case of Donald Trump, they can even win the presidency. Some of this reality is due to the extraordinary professionalism of the Republican political class, which has been consistently spinning straw into gold for decades through gerrymandering and voter restriction laws. But Democrats are the cause of many of their own problems as well, as we'll be discussing in the next several episodes here at Theory of Change. My guest in the first episode of this series is Michael Kazin. He is a professor of history at Georgetown University and the author of a new book called What It Takes to Win, I'm going to rephrase that, and the author of What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. And it is a look at the party from its very beginning up until the 2020 presidential election. So thanks for being here today, Michael. Welcome to Theory of Change.
Thanks for asking me, Matthew.
All right. Well, so there's your book is a very long one with a very meaty subject, obviously. Why did you decide to focus on this topic?
Well, I've been a Democrat, capital D, small d, for a long, long time, since I stopped being a self-proclaimed revolutionary about 50 years ago or so. And I thought that, there's really no serious study of the Democrats as an institution throughout their history, looking at the kind of coalitions that were built, looking at continuities and discontinuities in the ideology of the party. And as a Democrat with a capital D, I also wanted to figure out, what it's done wrong, what it's done right, and how it can do better. Also, I should say that my son is a Democratic Party operative, has been for a long time, since he was in college 16 years ago. And so I've learned a lot from him about how the party works internally, and that kind of inspired me to learn more about that. So I think, as a historian, I'm always trying to, answer questions about the present by using the past. And the question about the present is, sort of piggybacking off your introduction, what have the Democrats done right? What have they done wrong? And what are the roots of that? How do we understand that evolution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is interesting that a lot of people have begun considering this question, very recently. Like your book is one of several that have come out in the past year or two that kind of looking at, well, what is the left need to be doing? How are they doing things wrong or right? Which is interesting because there weren't a lot of those books, for a number of years, as you were saying. And now one of the sort of contentions of a lot of these books that have come out, and we'll be talking to some of the other authors, so I won't make you have to respond to them unless you want to. But one of the contentions...
I just reviewed a book by two friends of mine called "Where Have All the Democrats Gone," which is one of the books you might be talking about, by John Judas and Rita Shera. So
yep. It's well, and the thesis of a number of these books has been that the Democratic Party needs to focus more on economic issues and go away from social issues. And your approach is different than that, and I think it's that's why I actually wanted to start this series on the show here with your book, because I think you understand that because yours is a more historical focused one than some of these other ones that are more poll driven or data driven. I think you realize that that's not necessarily going to work. This idea. So why, in brief, why do you say that wouldn't work?
Well, yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, I do think
Only.
Democrats, in order to become a majority party again, do need sort of economic populist message. They need to, make very clear what they want to do for people and link up with movements like labor unions and other movements which want to, help people across lines of identity, and of course lines of race and gender preference. I think that's really important. So I do agree with some of the popularists, if you can call them that, about that. On the other hand, I don't think you can escape what the party already is, which is a coalition of young leftists who care very deeply about cultural issues and unions which are struggling to revive, and they haven't really revived very much yet. So one can't just say, "Aha, this is what Democrats should do," and why don't they do it? One of the things about being a historian that's useful, I think, to this argument, to this discussion, is that you can't leap beyond what the party is. You have to figure out how to convince people in the party to do things differently, to stop attacking one another for what are basically very small differences. I think, and you also have to do that within a context of what might be a declining empire, a context where, of course, Americans more and more are. They might be strong partisans, but they don't like parties. And so, if you're going to be you're going to be one of the two major parties, you have to understand how to deal with that fact, how to get people engaged with the party as a party again. If you can't do that, then you end up, competing with the likes of Donald Trump for media time, and for attention, and for glitz, so to speak. So, I mean, that's a long answer to your question, but that's sort of more my impulses than my answers, if you will.
Your point about people not being interested in the Democratic Party as a party or parties generally is an important one, and that's why I thought it was. I think it's relevant. The first part of the book where you talk about the origins of the Democratic Party as a party, because you rightfully note that the Democratic Party is the oldest political party in the world. And those days, in the early days of the Democratic Party, are, I think, really relevant, especially now when people are so interested or disinterested in political parties. Can you tell us a little bit about those early days and how the Democratic Party came to be?
Well, it really arose at a time when, for the first time in world history, the United States was a nation which enfranchised all white men, who were, of course, white people, the majority of the population at the time. And that was unusual, because that wasn't true in any other nation, even nations that were somewhat democratic, like Great Britain at the time. We had a very small, number of men actually being able to vote. And on the heels of that, Martin Van Buren, who doesn't get enough respect, I think, from historians, began to put together a party based on working class men in the North and planters in the South, slaveholders for the most part in the South, behind the candidacy of Andrew Jackson, who they saw as was this sort of charismatic figure, military hero. And originally, the party was called the Jackson Party, not the Democratic Party, because it was put together in order to boost the candidacy of Andrew Jackson in the 1828 election. But as Tocqueville wrote, in his great book, Democracy in America, this was the golden age of associational life in America, of community organizations of various kinds, fraternity groups, drinking societies, immigrant groups as well. Tammany Hall gets going at that point, which was, the most powerful democratic machine in the 19th century, early 20th century in America, in New York City. And so, the party originally was really an association of white men across regions who agreed on opposition to what they considered to be the most powerful elite in the country at the time, which were bankers in Philadelphia and New York, which was Wall Street investors. Wall Street just beginning to be organized as a powerful institution at the time. And in some ways, this goes back to the famous debate between Jefferson and Hamilton about how much power the central government should have. Democrats originally actually believed, very different from now, that the central government was run by an elite, and the less government power, federal government power that is, the better, because they thought that the federal government would always be in the hands of a economic elite, and so the less power it had, the better. But I think when you have universal white manhood suffrage, you have the environment that's really ready for a mass party to form. And we can talk about how that happened. The Democrats did not create universal white manhood suffrage, but they actually obviously supported it, and they were very active in signing up immigrants who came to the country almost as soon as they got off the boat from Europe. Even before they were citizens, they found ways to sign them up. So Democrats really were responsible, you might argue, not just for building the first mass party in American history, but for creating popular American politics the way people understood that in the 19th century. And really, their opposition party was formed in opposition to the Democrats specifically, called the Whig Party. It's called the Whig Party because the Whigs were the anti-monarchy party in England, and the Whigs opposed King Jackson, the power of so-called monarchical, tyrannical President Andrew Jackson. So in that sense, Democrats were really created their own opposition as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that they did, the early Democrats did that you document very well, is that they created the idea of partisan newspapers as a way of spreading awareness of the party's message and awareness of the candidates. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, most newspapers were partisan in the 19th century, really up until the early 20th century, believe it or not. I mean, there's still papers around the country with Republican and Democrat in their names, even though they try to show at least that they're not partisan anymore. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that Van Buren understood very early on, when he was actually a power in sort of what was called the Republican Party in New York State, which was the biggest state in the country, was he said, in order to convince people to support our party and to support our policies, we have to start our own newspaper. It's called the Albany Argus in the capital of New York and Albany. And that became the model for Jacksonian/Democratic newspapers in every major city in the country. And those newspapers were often supported unofficially by money from the Democratic Party. And some of the editors of those papers went on to be in the Jackson administration and then in the Van Buren administration as well. So, of course, these newspapers were the media of the day. There was nothing else that would spread it. And because congressmen had the right, the franking privilege to send out materials from their office for free, some Jacksonian Democrats would send out these newspapers around the country. So it was really a national machine in that sense.
It was, yeah. And you mentioned it briefly just a minute ago about the idea of the Democratic Party was, anti-national government, anti-federal government for a long time, or from the very beginning of it. But it's also that there was this kind of has emerged in the present day as kind of the ideological divisions between the parties. It didn't really exist in the first 150 years or so, roughly, of the United States. You could perhaps say, roughly. And so there was this constant interplay between people who had what might be now termed as more, right-wing beliefs and more left-wing beliefs, but they were always in both of the parties. And that's something that those tensions, especially within the Democratic Party, they kind of really kind of, I mean, you talk extensively about that, how various factions within the party we're pushing for really, in many ways, opposite ideas. Do you want to expound on that a little bit more here for
Sure.
the
Well, I
audience?
should say, though, certainly there were many factions. And I think to be a successful party in a two-party system, you have to
Yeah,
have a diverse group, at least demographically, if not ideologically. Otherwise, you're not going to win the electoral college, and not going to take over
yeah,
not going to win the Senate, especially, and of course the House as well, or control state governments to any great extent. But the Democrats did have, a ethos, if not an ideology, which bound them together for a long time. And again, it was, in opposition to what they saw as governing elites, financial elites, especially in the Northeast, and later on also industrial elites. And so, in some ways they're united by their enemies, I think it's fair to say. And that's one of the things which kept them together until the Civil War. And then, of course, slavery made it impossible for Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats to stay together, because Northern Democrats were very concerned with the rights of white workers in the North, and the working class was growing with immigration from Ireland and from Germany, especially in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And so the Democrats, of course, even those who didn't have slaves, didn't own people, nevertheless often wanted to be able to own people. And rising in the world, if you're a Southern Democrat, meant be able to have in order to own slaves at a certain point. So that difference was too great in the party to compromise. And so 1860, you have two Democratic tickets. One, the Vice President of the United States named Breckinridge, running as a Southern Democrat, and Stephen Douglas, Senator from Illinois, who famously campaigned against Lincoln earlier for Senate, as a Northern Democrat. But then it's quite remarkable, if you think about it, that the party stayed together after that. It stayed together. Of course, the Northern Democrats stayed in Congress and were able to elect governors in places like New York State during the Civil War. They opposed the draft, for example. They wanted the North to win militarily, but they opposed the emancipation of slavery. They opposed giving Black people the vote. And then they stayed together also in the late 19th century, opposing tariffs, helping the big industries, for example. That was a big issue for Democrats. So in some ways, the Democrats began as the party for the ordinary white man. They expanded as the party for the not so ordinary white men who had a lot of property in the South. But then they kept calling themselves the democracy, in fact, capital T, capital D, because they really believed, I think all Democrats did, that they were the representatives of, the people, and the Whigs first, and then the Republicans were the party of elitists. In fact, down till the 1860s and 70s, some Democrats are still calling the Republicans Federalists. The party of Alexander Hamilton, which was a self-consciously elitist party back in 1800.
Yeah.
So I think Democrats did have these differences, of course, and they continue to have them. Another time, if just mention another big split in the Democratic Party, the second split after the 1850s, happened in the 1890s during the Great Depression, when Grover Cleveland was president, Democratic president, very conservative Democratic president. And the Depression happened under his watch, and he crushed a national railroad strike, which didn't make him popular among a lot of working class Democrats. Of course, he had to go to J.P. Morgan to try to bail the Treasury out from the Depression, because there wasn't enough money in the federal treasuries to pay off salaries and get the economy out of the Depression. And then William Jennings Bryan, the guy who wrote a biography about several years ago, runs as this insurgent Democratic candidate in 1896. And he really remakes the party and tries to pull it away from the more conservative influences of people like Grover Cleveland and richer Southerners in general.
Yeah. Although even he had that multifaceted aspect himself because he was a Christian fundamentalist as well.
Yeah. But then, he was, of course, most American Christians, really up until the middle of the 1930s or so, were really evangelical Protestants. That was the default religion of most Americans, and Catholics and Jews and sort of mainline Protestants were seen as some on the margins, even though the mainline Protestants had a lot of power, of course, but they didn't have as many people. So Bryan, but he did have a problem, again, getting to the divisions of the party. Bryan did have a real problem attracting Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Jews to some degree, especially those in cities, because he was perceived and wanted to be perceived in some ways as the candidate of rural America, of small farmers. And of course, in 1896, he got the support of the Populist Party, the People's Party, which was the insurgency of small farmers. So again, in some ways, it's perhaps inevitable that when a party begins to gain power, that it grows in its appeal, but that appeal ends up also leading to divisions in the party because people want to take it in different directions to, from their point of view, keep it winning. But those divisions often end up hurting the party and leading to it dividing and losing.
Yeah. One of the persistent themes in the book is about, who is the party for?
Right.
And it's a question that there is never a defined answer to that, because that's the nature of political parties, is that it's for whoever is going to vote for it, basically. But it's more serious than that, of course, because, especially now in the present moment, that the opposition party to the Democrats is, Donald Trump is pretty much running as, I'm going to literally lock up my political opponents. I'm going to prosecute people who I think are mean. People who did not obey me while I was the president. I want to execute them, which is what he said about.
And he's called Democrats or communists, radical leftists, anarchists. I forget all the terms he uses to describe. Poor Joe Biden is not everyone's idea. Not many people's idea of an anarchist.
Yeah, or a communist for that matter.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting dilemma, though, that the Democrats are facing, as I mentioned in the introduction, is that they, the Republican Party has policies that the things that it wants to do, most people disagree with. And this is a very common lament that I hear from people, especially who support things like single payer healthcare or, some sort of universal healthcare system. They're constantly saying, well, if we just talk about our ideas more, then we would win. But the history of the Democratic Party shows that that's not necessarily the case, and it never has been. Right?
That's true. And as we were discussing before, having large, powerful, intelligent social movements has always been important to the Democrats. I mean, arguably, there was sort of a Jackson movement before there was a Democratic Party. Jackson felt he was cheated out of winning the 1824 election, so-called corrupt bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. But then the People's Party, really does, help to change the Democratic Party. Bryan doesn't win, but Democratic Party of Wilson and later on of Franklin Roosevelt too is in many ways a party which is trying to institute a lot of the ideas and policies and use a lot of the rhetoric that the populists had helped to infuse in the Democratic Party. And of course, the labor movement, as I write about in the book, is so essential to not just helping Democrats win in the 30s, but really changing them from being a party where the white South was really their base into a more of a national party, and also beginning the process of finally getting the Democrats to leave their racist heritage behind. because the unions of the CIO in the late 1930s are interracial unions, and they're very strong in the Midwestern states, those swing states. They were swing states then, they're swing states still, and they were essential to the Democrats winning in those states.
Yeah, and yet in the intervening decades, the power of unions generally has shrunk, and we're seeing somewhat of a resurgence of that current, the present moment, with people beginning to do strikes and things like that. Is that do you see things reversing in that degree? And
Well, it takes a while.
I feel like to some degree, I feel like Democrats on the people on the left may not appreciate how important that unions are for.
I think they are more and more. The problem is it's been so long since at least private sector unions were powerful in this country that most people don't, especially most Democrats, especially most educated Democrats, don't know anybody in a union.
They have no memory of it.
Except maybe now in graduate student unions, places like where I teach, where they're very strong. But that's sort of the exception that proves the rule,
Yeah.
But look, I think I do argue, and I've always thought this, that I'm also a labor historian. I mean, I think working class institutions are essential to having a more egalitarian America. People have to organize themselves. They can't just look for help from on high. They have to organize themselves. That's the essence of democracy. But I think unions are stirring, certainly. And as you know, the UAW won this big victory over the big three automakers. The Teamsters won a big victory recently over UPS. There's a lot of Starbucks workers who are organizing, though they're being stopped from getting a contract. And Biden, for all his problems, is the most pro-union president in American history. Even Franklin Roosevelt did not have union leaders to the White House and embraced them and said, in effect, workers should join unions. So it's quite astonishing that Americans who like unions, 70% of them in a recent Gallup poll, favorable unions, don't realize that their president is really favorable to unions because he understands how important they are to breaking through, the Democrats to break through to win more working class votes. So the problem is, unions are not easy to organize under the Labor Relations Act that I have now. It's much easier for employers to scare workers to saying, well, if you vote for the union, fine, but then I'm going to close down your factory, close down your workshop, whatever. And also, and the penalties for breaking the labor law for employers are very, very slight, really. It can take years to adjudicate violations of the law. So it's a real problem. The only time unions in American history really grow, they grow in surges. They grow from 3 million members in 1933 to 15 million members in 1945. From 500,000 members in late 1890s to 2 million members by 1920, for example. So I'm sorry, 5 million members by 1920. So, and that's not happening yet. And if it doesn't happen, Democrats will have to find some other way to appeal to working class voters, I'm afraid.
Well, and I mean, and I would say you're right that people have to organize themselves, but I think that unions have not done as good of a job in giving people the tools to do that and helping them understand what they can get out of it. I mean, because that to me is kind of the fundamentally reactionary position is your life sucks and you can't do anything about it. This world is terrible. So just sit back and embrace the shit. That's basically the position. And so getting people to realize, look, I deserve better than what I have. That ultimately is the dilemma, I think, that the left is facing in any country that people have, more equality-based viewpoints. And I don't know that that's something that is kind of common in the discourse in the center to left media. I don't think it's
talked about
very much.
I think you're right. And I mean, young activists, I wish most young activists wanted to be union organizers instead of organizing to do things that are fine, but like trying to take down Confederate statues or change the curriculum. But being a union organizer is tough because you have to talk to people who are not like you, very often. Union organizers have always been more educated than the workers that they're organizing. I'm writing a biography now of Samuel Gompers, actually, who was a poor kid, really, immigrant from London, but he educated himself. He read lots of Marx, and he learned from reading Marx that only unions can emancipate the working class. He stopped being a Marxist when he become a national labor leader, but that wisdom is still important, I think. I think it is how I don't mean to be a downer here. I think there is a lot of union organizing. DSA, which I have some problems with as an organization, nevertheless, a lot of people in there are very supportive of unions. Bernie Sanders, obviously, supportive of unions. AOC. So progressive Democrats, especially, are very supportive of unions, and they're pretty vocal about it too. That has not always been true, but I think they are. But being vocal is not enough. You've got to have mass actions, and to make it seem, as you said, that it's possible to change your life with your brothers and sisters. That it's not dismal, and there's just not enough of that. It's happening in spots, but in the 1930s it happened pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and one of the other sort of tensions with regard to labor organizing is that there are some different imperatives between public sector unions and private sector unions, and that's something that has, I think, that has had an impact in terms of how the Democratic Party operates and what policies that it prioritizes, as private sector unions have become less powerful and less.
That's definitely right. I think a very large proportion of the delegates to the 2020 convention, for example, were members of public sector unions, especially AFSCME and the American Federation of Teachers, and some from the SEIU as well, which has some public members. It is indicative, as you say, that the American Federation of Teachers is one of the strongest groups in the Democratic Party. I'm very supportive of teacher unionism, but the fact that people with college educations, which most teachers have, are such an important group in the Democratic Party does send a signal to a lot of folks who don't have college educations. Yeah.
Well, and that's you allude to that in the last chapter of the book, which you have called "Cosmopolitans in Search of a New Majority." What do you mean by that term when you say?
Well, I mean that the core activists of the Democratic Party are people like me, mostly younger than me, thank God, but people like me who have college educations, who grew up usually in a big city or suburbs, who are not very religious, who are read the New York Times and listen to NPR, and who get their information from places like that, and they realize if they're Democratic operatives, like my son is, and like a lot of people he works with in the party, that they need to, of course, win over a majority. That's what it means to have a democratic country, or should mean anyway. But there was a gap between them and a lot of the people that they're trying to reach, and so they're always looking for candidates who will be like John Tester in Montana, for example. Has a farm, is not, or people serve in the military. This guy running for the Senate against Josh Hawley in Missouri, for example. Now I can't remember his name, but he's in the Marine Corps for 15 years. He was a lawyer in the Marine Corps, but still he was in the Marine Corps. And so connecting with average Americans on the part of Democrats who are not, really representative of average Americans is a problem. Especially without a strong labor movement. You've got folks who are to a certain extent being missionaries. You could argue, or at least are trying not to appear that way. And so that that's a problem. I mean, look, Nancy Pelosi, who I think was very successful in many ways as a politician, is symbolic of that. I mean, she comes. She's originally grew up in a working class machine in Baltimore, where her father was mayor of Baltimore. So was her brother for a short period of time. But then, of course, she married a rich guy and moved out to San Francisco. And San Francisco, of course, as you know, became the very emblem of elitist Democrats. Still is, unfortunately. So that's sort of a good example of cosmopolitans, even those who did not grow up cosmopolitan the way Pelosi did.
Yeah, well, and it's also that the idea that the Republican Party has explicitly oligarchical policies in terms of trying to give money to rich people through tax cuts or subsidies. But they're able to push a populist narrative, and they do it. They refashion it every few years. So for people are claiming Trump is this new kind of Republican, which is literally the same thing that they said about Newt Gingrich in the 90s. He's a different kind of Republican, a populist Republican.
And Ronald Reagan, especially, yeah.
And Ronald Reagan, yeah, like they recycle this every few years, and it's nonsense. But the thing that it does have that's powerful is that it's refashioning the word populist to be a term about your intellectual approach, your epistemology. And so, by overtly embracing, anti-intellectualism and religious fundamentalism, they're able to not only motivate a lot of people for whom that's very important, but they're also able to, sort of depress Democrats who may be more, religiously fundamentalist, like many African Americans, like many white Americans in the Midwest, and Hispanic Americans in various areas where they live. Like that's why you see them pushing for that so much, even for Republicans who might be more, Ayn Rand militant atheists. They see it as a useful way of dividing and conquering.
There aren't many of those Randians left, I don't think, in the party, but at least not publicly.
Elon Musk seems to be one.
Yeah. Well, rather powerful. Yes. I wrote a whole book called "The Populist Persuasion," which is about the uses of populist language and symbol and imagery in American history. And this goes way back to McCarthyism, really. McCarthy talking about people born with silver spoons in their mouths who are selling the country out. Alger Hiss, Dean Acheson, people like that, and it was very successful. I mean, Father Coughlin back in the 30s was first a Democrat and then becomes basically a fascist. Was talking like that as well. And look, as you know, religion is always been very important in American politics ever since. Really the beginnings of the country. And so if you can make the Democrats sound like the anti-religious party, then you can have a lot of success, even at a time when fewer and fewer Americans really are very religious. That's one thing Democrats probably have on their side, actually, in the abortion debate and the debate about, LGBTQ rights as well, is that, more and more people, especially young people, just, religion is a nice idea. But it's not a serious faith in their lives, I think. And so it's no longer possible to say, it's no longer possible to use, that kind of populist religiosity against Democrats as much as it used to be.
Well, but it's still, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the surveys have shown that, the fastest growing demographic group in America, which is Hispanic Protestants, who are overwhelmingly evangelical.
Pentecostals, yeah.
Yeah, and they're majority Republican now.
No, it's true. It's true.
So and that is, it's starting to eat away also at some of the Democratic Party's efforts with Black men in particular, but and getting people disinterested in the Democratic Party. And that's why you do see so much of the focus, especially recently, on transgender people and these manufactured grooming allegations. And I think a lot of people, they see that the right is doing this flagrant manipulation on the left, and their response is to say, well, we need to just walk away from those issues and those people that they're attacking. But I don't think they realize that the right wing is going to seize upon anything. Like, just the fact that you oppose them as a political party means that you're a communist, regardless of what you say. Like, that's the part I feel like a lot of the more popularist, I guess you'd call them, and that they don't seem to get. It's that you can run away from these issues all you want. It's still not going to make them stop.
Also, as I said in this review of, as I mentioned before, of the book by Teixeira and Judas, young people are obviously, given their age, the future of the Democratic Party, if it has a future. I think it does, but and as they are of the Republican Party. And you can't run away from issues they care about. You can't just say, oh, well, you shouldn't talk about that. Talk about this. You can say strategically, we should talk about it differently, but you can't tell people they should not care about transgender rights. You can't tell people they should not care about policing. You can't tell people they should not care about obviously abortion. That's of course a winner right now for Democrats. And so you have to find ways. Again, it's a coalition. You have to find ways to make everyone in the party happy enough so that they will support the same candidates and work really hard for them. You can't escape it. You can't find the perfect agenda. As I said, it's not about making sure that you get the polling majority for every race. It's about keeping the party together, which can become an organization which actually can elect people, and then once it elects people, can actually govern and change the society in good ways. That's your theory of change there. I think that's, and look, people on the left are guilty themselves of just being moralists and purists. And how come we didn't call that person they? They want to be called they. How could you have done that? You have to call people. You have to use the term Latinx. You can't call people Latinos or Hispanics, even though 97% of Hispanics and Latinos want to be called Latinos and Hispanics. Each side in this division has its problems. Keeping their minds on what will produce a successful party.
Yeah. Well, and one model for moving forward, I think, is is to look at the way that the right built their movement as well. Like, so not only did they didn't really have much of a social movement. What they started from was an activist movement.
Yeah.
And they did it through developing a concept which they called fusionism. And do you want to talk about that, what that was for people who don't know that term?
Sure.
And what it meant for them.
Yeah. In the mid-1950s, William F. Buckley Jr. started National Review magazine, a very small magazine at first, but then it became the most influential magazine on the right. And actually, an ex-communist named Frank Meyer put forth the idea that the different kind of conservatives in America needed to unite. They needed to fuse their energies against liberalism, basically, against liberalism and pro-communism, as they saw it. The three parts were economic libertarians, some of whom were, reading and trying to proselytize in favor of the ideas of Ayn Rand. Some of whom were just sort of Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, entrepreneurs who didn't like unions, didn't like regulation, didn't like corporate taxation. The other one were religious conservatives from all religions really, but especially Christian Protestant conservatives and Catholic conservatives. The other one were people who were primarily interested in the Cold War, who wanted a stronger military, wanted to not just to contain the Soviet Union, which was the official liberal document at the time, but to overthrow the captive nations run by communist parties. So Meyer and National Review Meyer helped National Review to become a place where these three groups came together. They wrote for National Review. They wrote for other magazines as well, and they got behind the candidacy of Barry Goldwater in 1960 when he didn't decide to run for president, and then in 1964 when he did, and that was the coming out party, so to speak, of the conservative movement as a political force in the country. Hope that's accurate. As a former conservative, you would be able to correct me. But,
yeah, well, and it's also that the concept is to tell them, if you're a member of any of these three different factions, you need to understand that overall you're headed in the same direction as the other two, and so you should support them, and at least close your mouth and don't complain about.
You've got a common enemy. You've got a common enemy. That's the key.
Yeah,
united by a common enemy. Communism abroad, liberalism at home.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately is the something like that has to be done on the American left in the 21st century. That people need to understand that when the overall the thing that you're trying to do is get rid of injustice, and injustice has many different facets, and you need to understand that they are linked. Like there's that fable of out of ancient India of the blind man and the elephant.
Right.
That each man thinks that when they discover the elephant, and they can't see it, of course, so they each think that the essence of the elephant is the leg or the ear or the trunk or whatever, and it's only by understanding that these things are all actually part of the same thing. And so if you are interested in whether it's worker organizing or women's rights or regulation of businesses or any of these, or police reform or racial injustice, that's you need to get sight of the larger picture, because it's too easy to focus on just one thing and think that that's the answer, because it's not.
Of course, Democrats do have a common enemy now. It's Donald Trump. But that's Democratic activists. That's so far, according to the polls, not enough to get Biden reelected or to keep control of the Senate and win control of the House. So,
yeah, well, and also there was the idea of having a vision of the future. Like you don't like that when you look at particularly large Democratic victories in American history. It's always been one of the biggest components. Is there is a vision of something that we're moving toward that's bigger than just the one person.
No, I agree. And the only thing Democrats have now is a green economy, I think, which is a common vision. Everything else, there's no substance to anything else. But as we know, a green economy is not easy because there's a lot of entrenched interests who oppose it, and it's very expensive. So, no, I mean, I think, look, not to be nostalgic here, but the Four Freedoms speech that FDR gave in 1944 is still, a good common vision.
And what were those?
I should remember them all. Everyone has freedom from religion, of religion, of course, at a time when there was a lot of World War II, of course. The Holocaust was taking place, though most Americans didn't know that. That's freedom from fear. Freedom to have, healthcare, be able to pay for it, freedom of housing, freedom to have a job, basically he called the Economic Bill of Rights. And building on the Bill of Rights, which is about, of course, individual freedom, to a kind of collective idea of freedom, which, of course, every individual can benefit from. I mean, it's really an American version of social democracy, which is, my politics, and a politics which I think most, Democrats, whether they know the term or not, do support, actually. But they aren't capable, for all kinds of reasons, for putting that together into a coherent package. And in the book, I call this moral capitalism, but at least more recent iterations of it. And that's not a good term either. No, they're not going to use that term. But the term itself matters, but not as much as people agreeing on the substance and agreeing to commit themselves to whatever their other ideas to agree on that substance. And
well, and
you know,
oh yeah, and I would say also, I mean, one of the other challenges faced by the American left is the fact that, because the American right is not really conservative, it's more reactionary. That means that it has really no. There are almost no, especially in the social sciences or humanities, there are almost no conservatives, just simply because they can't hack it. Their ideas, like if your idea of science is that humans, were created by God, like if that's your idea of science, well, you're not going to have, you're never going to have a job in a biology faculty. And if your idea, of history is, God created Adam and Eve, and and the world is 7,000 years old, and the Bible is literally true. Like if that's your idea of history, then obviously you're not going to make it in the history department. And like there are people that I've known who were, when I was Mormon, that they were explicitly discouraged from getting into the academic fields of ancient history or biblical archaeology or things like that, and they were told that if you go into these fields, your testimony will not survive. And they never backed that up to wonder, well, maybe the testimony is not true. They never.
Yeah, we disagree a little bit about this, but I'm not sure how much we want to go down this road. But I think there are serious conservative thinkers, political theorists, not scientists maybe, but political theorists and even historians. But the problem is they tend to want to celebrate the past. They tend to want to lionize figures in the past rather than, as most historians do, liberals and leftists,
examine them,
try to understand the past empathetically, but not act as if things were much better back then. I mean, Make America Great Again is not a coherent historical approach. Because America,
or like that David Barton guy. My point being, though, that because these are more reactionary rather than conservative views, they're not in academia, and so the right, in the American right, thinks it's very envious of not having academic outposts, if you will. But in a lot of ways, it's disadvantageous to the left in the United States being so closely linked to colleges and universities. I would say.
And look, only something like 35% of Americans, 30-year-old Americans have college degrees, and despite so much attention to what's going on in colleges, in the media and everywhere else, and
then colleges themselves, are inherently anti-progressive like they're inherently conservative in how they're run. Like they are. They're constantly, begging billionaires for money. They are constantly oppressing their employees. They're constantly ripping off their students. And I don't want to. You're a professor, so I can say this, but
that's fine. I'm not defending it. I mean, it used to be you could go to University of California, Berkeley, basically for free, and now it's expensive. And because state universities are not really state universities anymore. They're private universities, which get 20% or less of their funding from the state government.
Yeah, and so and so I mean, irrespective of the people that are involved with it, it's just simply there are different incentives for being a professor. To become a professor, you have to do things that in some ways are I mean, like writing a dissertation obviously is about the least populist thing you could do. It's not something that I think anybody who's written a dissertation, when they're in the middle of writing it, and you tell people that you're writing it, a lot of people's reaction, unless they are in that environment themselves, is to be like, okay, well, let's talk about something else. They don't, and so. It's made the Democratic Party become more overly reliant on polling, because they don't have touch with the regular average person, whether it's just in terms of who runs the place or where they live. I mean, there's this extreme mid-Atlantic bias in left-wing institutions in the country. I mean, there's a lot of issues, and I don't know that a lot of the leadership seems to be aware of these things, as far as
I think they understand they need to win national elections, and so
no, they understand that, but they don't understand why it's hard for them, I think.
No, maybe not.
And anyway, so one of the other things that you talk about toward the end of the book is that you do talk about the temptation of third parties in the United States, and that's become especially more tempting, I think, to a lot of people who have more self-described socialist viewpoints. Whether they actually are a socialist or not, that's another question. But a lot of people have come to say that, well, the Democratic Party is not for me. I want to be a socialist, or I want to be independent or green or whatever. What would you say to somebody who has that perspective?
I'd say one of the two parties is going to win. And if you really would rather support a reactionary party that is going to nominate Donald Trump again, who doesn't believe in democracy, then fine, vote for a third party. Otherwise, lesser evil is much less evil than the Republicans. And, Joe Biden is an old guy. I wish he were younger. I wish he were more dynamic. But he has some good policies, and he's going to be the nominee. So, as in the famous line of the Rolling Stones song, which, Donald Trump likes to play at his rallies, you can't always get what you want, but you sometimes get what you need. And we don't need another term for Donald Trump. That's for damn sure. So, third parties can float ideas sometimes. The People's Party did that. The Progressive Party of Theodore Roosevelt did that in 1912. I can mention other third parties which have been interesting, but they don't win, and they're not going to win given our political system and the way it's organized. And so if there is a difference between the two parties, which I think there's a huge difference between the two parties, there's not always been, but there is now, then if you're on the left, you don't vote for the Democrats, you are sabotaging what you really care about in American life.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point. And, and a lot of people also need to understand that the right wing is also pushing you to go and vote for these other parties.
Sure.
Like they are explicitly going and fund a lot of these third party hopeless ventures with that in mind.
Yep, it's true.
All right. Well, so let me just put the book up on the screen here. So we've been talking today with Michael Kazin. He's the author of What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. And then you are on, at least for now, on Twitter over at mkazin, Kazin, for those who are listening. So thanks for being here, Michael.
Appreciate it. Great conversation. Thank you.
All right. So that is the program for today. I appreciate everybody for joining us. All right. So that's the program for today. I appreciate everybody joining us for the conversation. And if you want to get more episodes, just go to theoryofchange.show and you can get the full video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. Some of the content is available only for paid subscribers, but most of it is available in its entirety. And then if you go to flux.community, you can also check out some of the other podcasts that I am involved in. I got two other ones, one called Doom Scroll and another one called So This Just Happened. Doom Scroll is a look at the news from a comedic, and Doom Scroll is a satirical look at the news hosted by my comedian friend Lisa Curry and I, and our one guest every week. And then I've also got So This Just Happened, which is a look at the news and culture that I am hosting with my friend Callie Holloway, who is a writer at The Nation. So I hope you guys can check those out as well. Thank you very much. And if you want to support the show, you can subscribe at theoryofchange.show on Substack, but you can also do it over on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/discoverflux. Appreciate that very much. And especially those who are making this possible. Couldn't do it without you, and appreciate it. And if you're not able to support financially, please just tell your friends and family about a particular episode. I definitely could use your help in that regard. I appreciate anybody who can do that. Thank you very much.